We have 10 minutes now for questions, so by being brief, that's enabled you guys to ask questions that you want to take on this. So I'll throw it straight to the floor if there are any questions, and I believe there's a roving mic. Yes.
Thanks very much. Well, thanks very much for a very interesting presentation as well. One of the things you mentioned, Gemma, was that the scheme was post-construction. And that's quite nice to hear in a way, because when you look at the sort of BREEAM type assessments, one of the big bugbearers that people talk about is what happens after the planning consent is awarded, and especially in terms of delivery of environmental gain and green infrastructure. I guess my question is how will the Building for Nature sort of mesh in with the sort of BREEAM type assessment?
My own? Yeah. Thank you for your question. So they work side by side. If a scheme wants to is currently pursuing, for example, BREEAM communities, then what we have been talking to BRE about how the two things could be aligned, and we're just about to publish something which really clearly defines that. But the crux of it is Building in Nature really foregrounds the local context. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. So BREEAM communities, for example, covers off a lot more than Building in Nature is, looking at more than green infrastructure. So that they can kind of nest within each other. One way of thinking about Building in Nature is it's qualitative metrics. So there's much more role for the assessor to play in the context of that scheme. Have those standards been met? And the opportunity to deliver the evidence is there's more variability. So they are different. I mean, there's much more kind of emphasis in some of the BRE tools to be able to measure quantitatively things. So I think some of the feedback we've had with local authorities, for example, who currently have a suggestion that BREEAM should be brought forward in strategic allocations, for example, is there's often a perception of complexity, and then the initial findings from people working with Building with Nature is it offers less complexity, but that's, I mean, the standards are clear and robust. So the two can work together. They don't kind of they don't say things that are in tension, if that's helpful.
Okay. Sorry.
I was going to say, I might just offer another perspective on that. One of the challenges with BREEAM and the sort of candidate status of the Building for Nature scheme is an obvious in there, in that the client's going for planning and they're using this as a certificate to show that they're achieving a standard, either in BREEAM from a multitude, but from a green infrastructure point of view of Building for Nature. That's an in that client buys into, and that it addresses planning risk at that stage. Once planning permission has been granted and the ambition to get the actual achieved status for this, or the excellent status, there's another discussion to be had. Great difficulty with sites like Chesterton is that site will come forward with multiple developers in multiple phases, each one of which would have to engage with this benchmark to achieve it. There's a lot of positive sentiment with regards to this, and it's one of those schemes where design codes are fundamental to the outline planning permission, will come forward quickly, and therefore you have the chance to embed obligations to commit to these sorts of standards. But in most cases, that's not the case, and there's a real challenge there in seeing how developers will engage with these sorts of standards. And I think it's about developing that argument at the other end. I'm saying we present the value of these schemes in planning, but we also must present it as value to the house buyer. They must engage with the concept of buying into a house within a high-quality green space that delivers all of these benefits. And I think Gemma's met some of the house builders and gone to the sales offices and asked them about green infrastructure. And some of them will take you around and show you the hedgehog gates and the quality of the landscape. But there's a different and very specific challenge post-outline consent, which is where we need to aim to get this achieved and excellent standard implemented.
Can I just do a very quick follow-up question, which is who actually is going to be awarding that sort of Build with Nature kite mark?
Okay, so the certifying body will be the Town and Country Planning Association. So they offer that external verification. People work with Building with Nature assessors to get to the point of certification, and then we have an external certifying body, which is TCPA at the moment. So.
Okay, great. There's a question down here.
Thanks very much. Simon Petley from Enviromarket. We connect investors with natural capital positive investment opportunities. Just thinking about the 25-year environment plan and net environmental gain, possibly leading to net natural capital positive planning consent. I was thinking about your comment about difficulty in defining green infrastructure and planning departments knowing what it was. What do you see as the potential to move towards a more natural capital positive based consent? So an economic.
From a planning perspective, I do think it's incredibly challenging at the moment. In practice, what we see is a lot of talk about natural capital, which is never ultimately part of the planning discussion. Where it does come into effect, if I focus on the quantitative elements of it, biodiversity offsetting, qualification of losses of certain features, say hedgerows and so on, where it becomes very quantitative issue. That's one end, and that's gone as far as the Environment Bank being able to trade off losses on site with benefits perhaps off site. That's a sort of tradable commodity, if you like, specific to ecology largely. I don't see that much. You can't trade off impacts on a listed building by I suppose you have enabling development, but it's a very undefined planning concept to developing another listed building nearby. I think there's a lot of work to go, and I don't really see it developing as a holistic concept. And that's why I think the building of nature's got a lot going for it in that it's qualitative, rather than trying to break everything down into measurable units.
And maybe all I would add to that is I think we set out on this journey wondering what the obstacles were for delivering high quality green infrastructure full stop, more consistently across different local authorities areas, across different sites and the different ecological constraints and social needs, and as effectively, how do you create a tool which considers all of those factors and vectors and everything? So I think by talking to everybody at each point, so from the planners who conceive of what should be delivered locally to the developers and then the kind of implementation professionals, and what we kind of in broad terms, what we realised is the change happens in the conversations, in negotiations between the applicant and the people who approve the application. So having a better vocabulary and having a better framework to kind of to hold those conversations, that's often where the problem lies, actually. So Building with Nature is much more about how do we support planners to raise their confidence to ask for more and ask for better and ask for specific things in that area, and to kind of broaden the imagination and raise the confidence of delivery agents of green infrastructure to deliver better, to design better and deliver better. And then there's also the issue of how do we design better mechanisms and models for long-term management and maintenance. So I guess it's much more about the conversations that lead to the best results for that place.
Just very interestingly, I would add to that Dieter Helm, Natural Capital Committee, had stated his hope the provisions in the 25-year environment plan would be turned into regulation, and therefore there's always a tension between should these things be regulated or incentivized, and we hear here about some of the benefits of that negotiation process. Time for one very quick question with a very quick answer in 2 minutes. Is there one last burning question sitting here? No? Well, yes.
Hi, hello, thank you. So I wonder if you actually have done any analysis or evaluation of what you expected the green infrastructure to deliver, and before and after, if you have done any follow-up in terms of the ecosystem services.
Yeah.
And if you could be brief.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think what we recognise through doing this process is quite a lot said about what green infrastructure can deliver, and some of the evidence there is actually lacking in robustness. So we are project partners on this developing Builder in Nature was University of West of England in Bristol, and so we're currently working with them to define another project which can sit alongside, which starts to bring forward some of that evidence. So looking at ecosystem and ecological delivery. So we're potentially using a couple of the case studies where we assess what is there on the site before development in terms of its biodiversity value, and then measuring that afterwards, so we can actually more robustly tell that story with evidence, and then be able to kind of be more confident when we come out and say green infrastructure delivers biodiversity and net gain. So we're working on it, is the answer.
Yeah, but I think that the reality is our planning system is very front-loaded. So you have to demonstrate at the outset whether you will deliver with a degree of confidence that the planning authority will accept. There's nothing really in planning law at the moment that requires you to go back and see whether it worked. But interestingly, last year the EIA regs started to bring in the concept of monitoring. And we've yet to see how that plays out in practice, but the ability of the authority to require monitoring of environmental effects, and that could be measured in terms of outputs in green infrastructure, is now open to them, and we will see in the next few years whether they choose to use that, and to what extent they choose to use that power.
And just 10 seconds, Alistair. In the wildlife standards, if you're interested, you can go to the website and have a look at the user guide, which has all the detailed criteria. But one of the wildlife standards requires that ecological monitoring and maintenance and provision for that post-implementation. So, yeah.
And to add, I suspect it's really important from a Natural Environment Research Council perspective that this is one of 13 GI innovation projects. So by going to the NERC website, or if you're interested particularly in green infrastructure, mainstreaminggreeninfrastructure.com, you'll get a list of all of the other projects, some of which tap into this agenda.